My name is Arthur Voss. I'm 75 years old, and 4 days after my granddaughter told 40 guests at her own engagement party that my toast was kind of old-fashioned, she sat across from me needing both my formal blessing and my bank account number. Because it turned out the very tradition she'd dismissed in front of her fiancé's family was the one thing standing between her and the wedding she actually wanted. Welcome to Silent Honor, where we tell true stories about the quiet strength it takes to be underestimated by the people who need you most, and still choose to show up for them anyway. If you've ever had something you value gently laughed off by someone you love, only to watch them come looking for it days later, this story is for you. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight, and hit subscribe, because you're going to want to see exactly what happened at that kitchen table 4 days after the party. Let me start where this really begins. I spent 42 years as a Presbyterian minister, serving 3 different congregations over the course of my career, the last 26 of them at the same modest church outside Harrisburg, where I eventually married off half the young couples in 3 surrounding counties, including, decades ago, my own daughter Patricia. My wife Margaret passed 6 years ago, and since then I've lived alone in a small house near that same church, still occasionally filling in for the current pastor when illness or vacation requires it. Still carrying, I suppose, more of my old professional identity than most retired men my age. One tradition I carried through my entire career, and through my own family as well, was a formal grandparents' blessing, a specific, structured ritual I performed for every couple I ever married who had a living grandparent willing to participate. A practice rooted in older customs from my own grandfather's generation, involving a short-spoken blessing, a specific laying of hands, and a small ceremonial gift, traditionally a piece of jewelry or a family heirloom, passed from one generation to the next as a formal acknowledgement of the family's blessing over the marriage. My granddaughter Sophie is 26 now, my daughter Patricia's only child, and I want to be honest that Sophie and I have always had a genuinely warm relationship, closer in some ways than my relationship with Patricia herself during Patricia's own more rebellious younger years. Sophie used to sit through my sermons as a girl, genuinely attentive rather than merely patient, and she'd always expressed, at least until recently, real appreciation for the older traditions I've carried through my career and my family. Sophie got engaged 4 months ago to a young man named Julian, whose family, I learned fairly quickly, comes from considerable wealth, the kind of quiet, generational money that doesn't need to announce itself, but that shapes, subtly and pervasively, the expectations around any major family event. Julian's parents, Richard and Constance, are gracious enough people on the surface, but I sensed, from our first meeting, a particular kind of polished formality that made me wonder how comfortably my own more modest, more traditionally religious style of family celebration would sit alongside their considerably more contemporary sensibilities. I want to describe that first meeting in a bit more detail, because I think it planted the seed for everything that followed. Richard and Constance hosted a small dinner introducing both families, at their own home, a genuinely impressive property that made our modest family gatherings feel, by comparison, considerably smaller in scale. Throughout that dinner, Sophie seemed noticeably more careful than her usual self, choosing her words with a precision I didn't recognize from her ordinary manner, laughing a beat later than natural at Constance's jokes, the particular performance of a young woman trying hard to seem like she belonged in a room she wasn't entirely certain she belonged in. I noticed it that evening and told myself it was simply nerves, the ordinary anxiety of a new relationship's early family introductions. I didn't yet understand how much that particular anxiety would eventually shape her decisions. There was a phone call, about 2 months before the engagement party, when Sophie mentioned, almost in passing, that Julian's family had strong opinions about wedding aesthetics, her word, and that she'd been quietly researching contemporary wedding trends to make sure our side of the family didn't seem, in her words, too traditional or churchy compared to what Julian's circle typically expected. I remember feeling a small flicker of concern at that phrasing, though I didn't push on it directly at the time, telling myself, the way grandfathers often do, that young people navigate these social pressures in their own way, and don't always need an older generation's unsolicited commentary. The engagement party, held 4 months into their relationship, took place at a genuinely beautiful venue Julian's family had rented, an elegant space filled with exactly the kind of understated luxury that money arranges effortlessly when it wants to. I arrived, as I always do, early, wearing my one good suit, carrying a small wrapped box containing my grandmother's ring, which I'd intended to present to Sophie that evening as part of the formal blessing I'd already discussed with her weeks earlier, a plan she'd seemed genuinely excited about when we first talked it through. I want to describe what actually happened that evening carefully, because I think the specific sequence matters more than a general summary would capture. About an hour into the party, during the portion of the evening set aside for toasts, I stood, as planned, to deliver the formal blessing Sophie and I had discussed, beginning with the traditional opening words I'd used at dozens of weddings throughout my career. Words about the weight and privilege of a family's blessing being passed intentionally from one generation to the next. I noticed partway through a certain restlessness moving through parts of the room, particularly among some of Julian's younger cousins, a restlessness I initially attributed simply to the length of the toast rather than any genuine discomfort with its content. I performed the ceremony the way I always have, laying my hand gently on Sophie's shoulder as I spoke the specific, structured words, watching her eyes fill with tears, the way they always seemed to when I'd rehearsed this moment with her privately in the weeks beforehand. For those few minutes, standing in front of that elegant room, I felt the particular satisfaction of a tradition being carried forward exactly as intended, the same feeling I'd had dozens of times before at other families' weddings, except this time it was my own granddaughter standing in front of me, which made the moment considerably more significant to me personally than any of the professional ceremonies that had preceded it. I finished the blessing, presented the small box containing my grandmother's ring, and sat back down, feeling genuinely moved by the moment, the way I always have been performing this particular tradition, regardless of how many times I've done it. Constance, I noticed, dabbed at her eyes discreetly during the ceremony, an observation I registered at the time but didn't fully appreciate the significance of until several days later. Later that evening, standing near the dessert table, I overheard Sophie talking with 2 of Julian's cousins, young women close to her own age, who were asking, with polite but evident curiosity, about that whole blessing thing my toast had involved. "Oh, that's just my grandpa," Sophie said, laughing lightly. "He's a retired minister, so he's kind of old-fashioned about stuff like that. It's sweet, honestly, but definitely not really how most people do things anymore." I told him it was fine to do it, mostly because it means a lot to him, but I don't think Julian's family was expecting quite that formal a ceremony in the middle of a cocktail party. I want to be honest about what I felt overhearing that, because I think it matters more than the polished version I might otherwise offer you. I'd spent 42 years performing that exact ritual for other people's families, genuinely believing in its significance, and hearing my own granddaughter describe it to her fiancé's cousins as something she'd merely tolerated, something old-fashioned she'd allowed to happen mostly out of pity, landed with a particular sharpness I hadn't anticipated. I didn't say anything that evening. I finished my dessert, congratulated Sophie and Julian warmly when I had my proper moment with them, and drove home carrying something I didn't fully examine until I was sitting alone in my own kitchen, the small, hollow disappointment of having watched a tradition I'd built an entire career around get quietly filed under old-fashioned by the one grandchild I'd always assumed genuinely valued it. Let me pause the story right here for just a second, because I want to ask you something, watching at home right now. Have you ever overheard someone you love describe something meaningful to you as merely tolerated rather than genuinely valued? How long did that particular kind of hurt sit with you before anyone acknowledged it directly? Tell me in the comments, because I read every single one, and if this story is already feeling familiar, go ahead and hit that subscribe button now, because what happened 4 days later at my kitchen table is the part of this story you really don't want to miss. 4 days after the party, Sophie called, asking if she could come by that afternoon to talk about something important. I said, of course, genuinely uncertain what the conversation might involve, and she arrived looking considerably more anxious than her usual easy confidence, sitting across from me at my kitchen table with an expression I recognized from decades of counseling young couples as someone about to ask for something they weren't entirely sure they had the right to ask for. "Grandpa," she said, "I need to talk to you about two things, and I know the timing is going to feel strange given everything at the party, so I want to just be honest about both of them up front." "I'm listening," I said, keeping my voice level. "First," she said, "Julian's parents want us to do a formal engagement blessing at their family's country club. A bigger, more official version, actually incorporating the exact ritual you performed at the party. It turns out Constance's own grandmother did something almost identical, generations ago, from an old European tradition their family basically abandoned decades back, and when she saw you do it, she started crying, genuinely, and told Julian afterward that it was the most meaningful moment of the entire evening. She's been asking about it ever since, wanting to know if you'd be willing to perform a more formal version for their extended family too." I sat with that information for a long moment, the specific irony of it landing slowly. The very ritual Sophie had described as merely tolerated turning out to be the single thing that had moved Julian's mother more than anything else at the party. "And the second thing?" I asked. Sophie's expression shifted, the confidence draining slightly from her voice. "The venue for the actual wedding, the one we'd been planning around, had a structural issue discovered last week. Some kind of code violation that's going to take months to resolve. We lost our deposit, and we need to secure a new venue within the next 2 weeks, or we lose our preferred wedding date entirely. Julian's parents are covering most of it, but there's a gap, about $30,000, that needs to close fast, and Mom and Dad don't have that kind of liquid cash available right now. I know this is a huge ask, especially right after the party, but you're the only person in the family who could actually move that quickly." I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, absorbing both requests together. The formal blessing Sophie had dismissed as old-fashioned, now being requested at a grander scale by the very family whose approval she'd apparently been managing that toast around. And, in the same conversation, a request for a significant sum of money to solve an unrelated crisis. "Sophie," I said, "before we discuss either of these, I need to ask you something, and I want an honest answer. 4 days ago, I heard you tell Julian's cousins that my blessing was old-fashioned, something you tolerated rather than something you actually valued. Do you remember saying that?" Her face flushed immediately. "Grandpa, I didn't know you heard that. I'm so sorry. That came out wrong. I was just trying to explain the tradition quickly to people who didn't understand it yet." "I'm not asking so you'll apologize reflexively," I said. "I'm asking because I think there's an important tension sitting in this conversation that deserves to actually be named. You described something I've spent 42 years believing in as merely old-fashioned, something you allowed to happen mostly out of obligation. And now, 4 days later, you're telling me that exact tradition moved Julian's mother to tears, and separately, asking me for $30,000. I think all three of those things deserve to actually be sat with together, rather than treated as unrelated conversations happening to occur on the same afternoon." "Can I ask you something honestly?" Sophie said. "Would you have felt differently about the money request if I hadn't also brought up the blessing? If it had just been, 'Hey Grandpa, we need $30,000 for the venue,' would that conversation have gone easier?" I considered that question carefully before answering, because I wanted to give her an honest response rather than a comfortable one. Probably, yes, in the sense that I wouldn't have had two things to reconcile at once. But Sophie, the fact that both things arrived in the same conversation isn't really the problem. The problem is what the sequence reveals, that something meaningful to me got quietly dismissed the same week it turned out to matter enormously to the very family you were trying to impress, and that you came back needing both my blessing and my money in practically the same breath, without initially connecting those two things to what had happened 4 days earlier. Sophie was quiet for a long moment, and I watched something shift behind her eyes. The particular discomfort of someone realizing the ground beneath a hastily rehearsed request was considerably less stable than she'd assumed walking in. "I think," she said slowly, I was more worried about how Julian's family would perceive our side of things than I let myself admit. I've been so focused on making sure they don't think we're less sophisticated, less polished than their world, that I dismissed something genuinely meaningful just to manage their perception of us. And then Constance reacted the exact opposite way I expected, and it made me realize how badly I'd misjudged what actually mattered to people, including, I think, what actually matters to me. That's an honest thing to notice, I said. But Sophie, I need you to understand something before we talk about either the blessing or the money. I'm not upset because my feelings were hurt in some fragile, easily wounded way. I'm upset because you dismissed something I spent my entire career believing in order to manage an impression, and then came back 4 days later needing that exact thing, plus a significant sum of money, in the same conversation. I think that sequence deserves more reflection than a quick apology at my kitchen table. You're right, she said, and her voice cracked slightly. I've spent months trying to prove to Julian's family that our side of things is just as sophisticated as theirs, and I think somewhere in that effort, I started treating anything traditional, anything that felt like it came from your generation instead of theirs, as something to apologize for, rather than something to actually be proud of. Let me pause again for just a moment, because I think this next part matters considerably. I didn't answer either request immediately that afternoon. I told Sophie I needed a few days to think through both the blessing and the financial request properly, not because I doubted my willingness to help with either, but because I wanted the actual weight of what had happened at that party to have room to settle before we moved forward with solutions. 2 days later, Patricia called me, and I could hear immediately that she'd heard some version of our kitchen table conversation. Dad, Sophie said you're making her wait on both the blessing and the wedding fund. She's really stressed about the venue deadline. Is there a problem? There's no problem with either request specifically, I said. I told her I needed a few days to think it through properly, the same way I've approached every significant decision throughout my career. This is $30,000 and a ceremony I take seriously, and I think both deserve more than an immediate, reflexive yes, especially given everything else that happened at that party. Dad, she said something dumb to some girls she barely knows. Kids say dumb things when they're nervous and trying to fit in, Patricia said. I don't think her whole engagement needs to be contingent on some kind of extended lesson about it. I'm not making anything contingent on a lesson, Patricia, I said, keeping my voice level. I already told her I intend to help with both things. But I think there's a difference between rescuing someone from an uncomfortable moment and actually letting them sit with what that moment revealed. And I think this family has spent years choosing the first option so consistently that nobody ever really examines the second one. I did the same thing when I was her age, Patricia admitted, after a long pause. Trying to impress your first husband's family. Remember? I used to downplay how religious you were. Told his parents you were more of a community figure than an actual minister, because I thought it would make our family sound more sophisticated. I never told you that. I'm sorry. Hearing this happen to Sophie, it's bringing back some things I haven't thought about in years. I hadn't known that about Patricia, and hearing it, unprompted, in the middle of an already difficult conversation, added a layer of understanding I hadn't expected. It seems this particular instinct runs in the family, I said, the specific urge to quietly minimize what we actually value in order to seem more polished in front of someone else's world. Maybe that's exactly why Sophie needs this conversation to actually land properly, Patricia said, rather than just getting smoothed over the way I let mine smooth over decades ago. 4 days later, Sophie came back, without any specific request this time, and asked if she could actually understand the blessing ceremony properly. Not the quick version she'd absorbed as a child sitting through my sermons, but the actual history and meaning behind it. The specific reasons I'd built my career around traditions some people considered outdated. She sat at my kitchen table for nearly 3 hours while I walked her through the ceremony's origins, the specific families over 4 decades who'd told me, years later, how much that moment had meant to them, the particular weight of watching a grandparent formally, publicly acknowledge a marriage rather than simply attending it as a guest. There was a couple I married almost 30 years ago, I told her, the Hendersons, whose own grandfather had passed before the wedding. The bride asked if I'd perform a version of the blessing anyway, speaking on behalf of her grandfather's memory, using words he'd apparently used with her as a child. I still remember how the entire room went silent during that ceremony, not out of discomfort, but because everyone in that room understood, instinctively, that they were witnessing something that mattered considerably more than the flowers, or the catering, or any of the other details people spend months agonizing over. "Why do you think it still resonates so strongly?" Sophie asked, "even with people who didn't grow up with any tradition like it?" "Because most people, underneath all the modern polish, still want to know that the people who came before them actually see them, actually bless the choice they're making, in some formal, undeniable way," I said. Constance's grandmother apparently did something similar generations ago, in a tradition Constance's own family let quietly fade. I think watching me perform it reminded her of something her family lost without ever quite deciding to lose it. "I think that's what happened to me too, in a way," Sophie said. "I've been so focused on seeming modern and put together in front of Julian's family that I dismissed the one thing that actually connects me to something real, something that isn't just about impressing anyone." "Grandpa," she said, near the end of that conversation, "I want you to know, whatever happens with the venue money, I needed to actually understand this regardless. I think I've been treating things as old-fashioned that I just never bothered to actually learn the meaning of." I performed the larger, formal blessing ceremony for Julian's extended family 3 weeks later, at their country club, in front of nearly 80 guests, a considerably more elaborate version of what I'd done at the original engagement party. And I want to tell you honestly that watching Constance's genuine, tearful reaction again, this time joined by several other family members clearly moved by the same tradition Sophie had once dismissed as merely tolerated, felt like a particular kind of vindication I hadn't expected to need but genuinely appreciated receiving. Richard, Julian's father, found me afterward near the bar, his own eyes still slightly red from the ceremony. "I have to be honest, Arthur," he said. "I expected something considerably more modest, more perfunctory, when Constance first described what happened at the engagement party. I didn't understand until I actually watched it myself why she'd been so moved. There's something in that ceremony that our own family let go of 2 generations ago, and watching you perform it made me realize how much poorer our own celebrations have been without it. Tradition only feels old-fashioned," I told him, "until the moment someone actually needs what it provides. Then it just feels like exactly what was missing." I also wired the $30,000 for the venue deposit, about a week before that formal ceremony, structured, at my own insistence, as a documented loan rather than an outright gift, with a clear repayment plan Sophie and Julian both reviewed carefully and signed without hesitation, wanting, as Sophie put it, actual accountability, not just another thing we let slide because you're generous enough to absorb it quietly. In the months since, something has genuinely shifted in how Sophie talks about the traditions I've carried through my career. At the wedding itself, several weeks after the venue crisis resolved, she asked if I'd perform the full ceremony one more time, this version, in front of the complete wedding gathering rather than a smaller family audience. And when I finished, she stood and told the room, unprompted, exactly what that tradition actually meant to her, correcting, publicly and deliberately, the dismissive framing she'd offered at the engagement party months earlier. "My grandfather has performed this blessing for countless families over 42 years, she said. "I once described it to someone as old-fashioned, and I regret that more than almost anything I've said this entire engagement. It's not old-fashioned. It's the most meaningful 5 minutes of tonight, and I almost let embarrassment talk me out of wanting it at all." I want to be honest about how that moment landed for me. Standing near the back of that reception hall watching my granddaughter say those words in front of nearly 200 guests. It wasn't triumph exactly. It was something quieter and more durable than triumph. The specific relief of watching someone you love actually understand, in front of witnesses, what they'd almost let slip away out of a momentary need to seem impressive to people whose opinion, in the end, mattered considerably less than she'd allowed herself to believe it did. I think about that engagement party often now, sitting in my own kitchen some evenings, the same table where Sophie once sat asking for both my blessing and my bank account number in the same difficult conversation. How much of what we value gets quietly minimized, not out of genuine disrespect, but because someone we love is managing an entirely different pressure in a given moment, worrying about how they'll be perceived by a world they haven't yet learned to trust their own instincts within. Sophie didn't dismiss that blessing because she genuinely believed it was outdated. She dismissed it because, in that specific moment, impressing Julian's cousins felt more urgent than defending something she'd actually always valued. I don't regret taking those few days to think through both requests before responding, even though it meant Sophie had to sit with genuine uncertainty during an already stressful week. I want to say that plainly, because I know some people hearing this will wonder why I didn't simply say yes to both requests immediately, sparing her the additional discomfort. I think some moments require exactly that pause, that deliberate space for reflection, before a genuine understanding has room to actually take root, rather than a quick, reflexive resolution that lets the underlying tension go unexamined entirely. I don't tell you this story because I want sympathy for an old minister whose favorite tradition got momentarily dismissed at a party. I tell you this story because I want you to understand something important. The people who love us will sometimes minimize the things we value most, not out of genuine disrespect, but because they're managing an entirely different pressure in the moment, worrying about how they'll be perceived by someone else's family, someone else's world. That doesn't make the dismissal painless. It also doesn't mean the tradition, or the person carrying it, was ever actually as outdated as the careless moment suggested. I spent 4 decades believing in a ceremony my own granddaughter once described as something she merely tolerated. It took one honest conversation and one unexpected reaction from a stranger's family for her to finally understand exactly what she'd been dismissing and exactly how much weight that quiet, old-fashioned tradition still actually carried. Not just for the countless families I'd married over 4 decades of ministry, but for her own life, standing at the exact threshold those traditions were always designed to honor. There's a particular kind of quiet that settles over a kitchen in the evening, once the dishes are done and the only sound left is the old clock Margaret and I bought decades ago, still ticking steadily on the wall above the stove. I sit in that quiet most nights now, and I don't feel any different for the formal ceremony at the country club, or the $30,000 repaid faithfully every month since, or even Sophie's public correction at her own wedding. If anything, I feel more at peace than I have in years. Not because a tradition finally got the validation it deserved, but because my granddaughter finally understands, in a way that's actually changed how she carries herself, that the things worth valuing don't require anyone else's approval to remain genuinely meaningful. If this story reminded you of a moment when something you valued got quietly dismissed by someone you love, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and if you believe every family tradition deserves to actually be understood before it's labeled old-fashioned, hit subscribe, because we've got a new story like this one for you every single week.